Today's episode is brought to you by JEO Consulting Group. JEO Consulting Group is a full-service firm offering engineering, architecture, surveying, and planning to clients throughout the Midwest. Since JEO's beginnings in 1937, we have grown to more than 12 offices across Nebraska, Iowa, and Kansas. With over 250 employees, we provide innovative and cost-effective solutions for both public and private sector. The JEO team of professional engineers, architects, surveyors, planners, and financial experts all work in concert with skilled technicians and support professionals to exceed our clients' expectations. Hello and welcome to the Booked on Planning podcast. I'm your host, Stephanie Rouse, transportation planner with the Lincoln-Lancaster County Planning Department, and I'm joined today by my co-host, Rebecca Dorman, an associate attorney with the local government law group. We're here to get you hooked on planning through the books that have shaped the field. Let's dive in. Our guests today are Jenny Nolan and Patricia Salkin, authors of Land Use Law in a Nutshell. Jenny is a senior staff attorney and urban program specialist for the Land Use Law Center at Pace Law School, where she's also an adjunct professor teaching the evolution of land use and urban planning in America. Jenny's work focuses on the growth of urban centers, helping cities address obstacles to revitalization and sustainability. Patricia is the senior vice president for academic affairs and provost at Touro University. She's taught land use law courses and authored more than 100 books, articles, and columns on land use law, including the 5-volume American Law of Zoning and the 4-volume New York Zoning Law and Practice. Her blog, Law of the Land, can be found on WordPress. Can you start off by telling us how you got here to be the authors of Land Use Law in a Nutshell, and what about land use law captivates you?
A number of years ago at the American Association of Law Schools conference, Professor John Nolan and I were approached by a Professor Morton Gittleman from Arkansas, and he and his colleague Robert Wright had written a land use textbook, and they were looking for people to sort of take it over because they were getting ready to retire. And so they approached us to work on it, and we worked on it with them and eventually took it over ourselves. And Robert Wright had the first original land use nutshell book, and Mort Gittleman did an edition with him. And then with the case book sort of came the opportunity to put out a new edition of the nutshell as they retired. We redid a brand new edition, and since then we're now on the third edition. And then I'll let Jenny say how she got involved.
Thanks, Patty. As you might be able to tell from the last name, there's some relation to the previous author, John Nolan, and myself, Jenny Nolan. So that's how I got involved. I've been working in the field and working with my dad for, I think, probably 14 or 15 years now. And I work at a law school with him, and a few years ago started co-teaching the land use class with him. And over the years, the two of us have worked together on all of our projects and all of his scholarship. And, I've contributed over the years to all of that. And so when it came time for him to take a step back a bit from the nutshell, he asked me to take his place. And I was very honored to do so. And thank you to Patty for making that happen. I'm so grateful. And it's exciting to be involved with.
And just, Jenny is fantastic in her own right. And she's been a leader of the Planning Law Division of the American Planning Association. And, another place where this book really comes in handy for people studying for the AICP exam. But you asked about what excites us about land use. And I've been teaching land use since sometime in the 1990s. I've taught it at 2 law schools and 3 master's level planning programs. And what excites me about the subject is it impacts literally everything that we do. It impacts where we live, how we live. It impacts our schools, our quality of life. It impacts our public health, the air we breathe, the water that we drink. It's not an environmental law class, but it certainly is all related. It impacts everything really from, cradle to grave in terms of services that are provided, where the hospitals are, where the cemeteries are, and everything in between. And I tell my students, once you take the land use class, you realize how important this is to your everyday life. The roads that you drive on, the sidewalks that you walk on, the places where you shop, the places where you recreate, where you maybe go to church or synagogue. I mean, everything is there. The billboards, having a cell phone and where those towers can go. Everything in land use is about how we are organized as a society. So who can't be interested in that?
I would add to that, Patty, that I share Patty's enthusiasm, although she expressed it perfectly. And, there are just so many things that influence the way that we develop our landscape. And the cool thing about land use is how interdisciplinary it is. And we're looking at the environment, economics, science, technology, politics, racism, culture, convenience, resources. I mean, aesthetics, the list goes on. And many of those things influence the way we end up regulating the development of our landscape. And before I was teaching the land use class, I have been teaching for, I think about a decade now, a class that's sort of a foundational precursor to land use that has to do with looking at the influences on the development of our landscape in America for several hundred years and how we got where we are. And it's so much fun. Not to sound too geeky about it, but land use is really, really fun.
So I was just going to kind of go back to the writing of the land use law in a nutshell book and maybe who the initial target audiences might have been, and then any audiences that you've learned about that have been surprises.
The initial audience really was law students, because there are a number of different textbooks or case books in law school on land use. There are a lot of the same seminal cases, foundational cases that are there, and then they go off into other directions. And the idea of the nutshell was to put them all together and simplify land use in plain English, but using the cases and the black letter law and the takeaway from those cases. Over time, it became pretty quickly apparent that it was also a great handbook for professional planners and for members of planning boards and zoning boards.
I teach a graduate level land use law class, and I think I found the third edition of the land use law in a nutshell book last year. So I used it as a reference quite a bit in this last year when I was teaching the course. And so I just wanted to say that as an instructor, I think that it's a handy resource too, to kind of go back and refresh on cases before a class, or to find different ways to explain a concept that maybe I hadn't thought of before. So personally, I want to thank you both for your contribution.
That's terrific to hear. I'm so glad. It's nice to hear, it being used by you. That's wonderful. That's exactly what it's for, trying to help students or planners or teachers really with classes and understanding these foundational concepts.
This might kind of go into your practical experience as instructors of land use law, but I'm sure you're hearing from students that there's more and more of an interest in hearing from stories and experiences from non-dominant cultures, and bringing that into a land use law course can be tricky when we're trying to cover these seminal land use law cases that were argued by dominant culture and the decisions were written by the dominant culture at the time and still. So I wondered if you had any good ideas on how to bring in those voices, those experiences to kind of modernize the way that we teach land use law and meet those interests of our students.
It's a great question, and we're working on that now as we update our casebook. And there's a little bit of it still in the new third edition of the Nutshell. For example, we talk about some Native American issues, and that was in prior editions of the Nutshell as well. I think now people are really looking at reframing some of the issues when it comes to housing, when it comes to exclusionary zoning. And some of those cases are our seminal cases. They're just being taught a little differently. So, for example, the Euclid case. The Euclid case, the framing used to be that this was the seminal case that said that zoning is constitutional. And without this case, there wouldn't be zoning. But we always pointed out, in the teacher's manual, for example, in the case book, that there's a lot of exclusionary zoning language. supporting the underlying purpose of zoning here in calling apartment buildings and people who live in apartment buildings parasites, on the community. And, that certainly goes to creating zoning so that you could separate people of means from people of lower socioeconomic status. And, today in a different lens, that was not a good thing. And so, I think bringing that into the classroom, looking at some of the early cases out of Baltimore and other cities where zoning was used to segregate people of different races. And, courts in the beginning upheld it. And then there was a shift, obviously, and thankfully, to calling it unconstitutional. But going back and revisiting some of those early cases, making sure that people really understand, as great as zoning and land use regulation is, it can be used for positive and it could also be used for evil. And so we have to keep focused on all of the great things that it could do for communities and use that tool wisely, as opposed to for other things that really are not acceptable.
When we talk about Supreme Court decisions, sometimes I like to point out who, the main drafter was, or what kind of makeup we had on the court when the decision was being made. And I like to take some time to, talk about Thurgood Marshall and Sandra Day O'Connor. I didn't know if you have any cases or experience with doing something like that in your land use law courses.
One thing that I do in the very beginning, as we get through a little bit about nuisance law and some of the background principles before we go into zoning in the Euclid case, when we hit Euclid, I go into who all the players were in Euclid, and I talk about who the lawyers were who were representing both sides and what backgrounds they brought. And then I talk about Justice Sutherland, and I talk about how Justice Sutherland got to the U.S. Supreme Court, because the first time that he wanted to be nominated, he wasn't selected. And the person who blocked him was one of the lawyers in the case. And so I talk about a little bit of the political intrigue here, and were there other background stories or motivations that could have been going on, because the Euclid case is one of the only Supreme Court cases where they sent it back for a rehearing. I mean, that's just unheard of these days, and it is so rare. And so what exactly was going on, and what were the power plays, and who were the power brokers?
One thing that I do with my students in the very first class of land use is start out by really going back to how the law is about who and what has rights and what those rights are. What right does the government have over individuals? What rights do individuals have against each other? What rights do we have against nature? What are the other rights that there are that we have to consider? And how limited are we and why? And what system do we have to create to function as a society? And how all of that really boils down to values, right? It's about, land use law, like all law, really is about the interplay between problems that emerge and the evolution of a society's values. And, we talk about Aldo Leopold, going back to the land ethic, and how he talks about social from antisocial conduct. And, that really is the law, right? A society develops laws to function and to evolve these modes of cooperation and all of that, and bring that discussion of ethics and values at the beginning of the course into, throughout. I pull that throughout the rest of the class, and it comes up periodically. It's sort of, what does each decision that we're looking at, what does it say about how are we balancing things? What is this saying about us as a society? What choices are we making? What does this say about dominion versus stewardship, or, what cultures we're valuing, or, whatnot. So that's something that I do to bring it to life a little bit, not quite pulling in the Supreme Court justices, but it's something that's been very helpful, I think, in terms of having the students sit back and think about what is underlying the cases.
So this is a pretty specific question about the book. I noticed that there's the Louisville Metro's Hazard Mitigation Plan 2040 used as an example of local governments conforming to national laws. In this case, it's an example of conforming to the National Disaster Mitigation Act. And I just wondered how these plans come up for you when you're writing the book to be considered as examples. For example, how did you land on the example land use law in the nutshell?
in this case, we were looking for example of a local plan that conformed to state plans. And actually this one was, we have a former student who's now an administrator at FEMA, and reached out to him, and he put us on to a few good local plans. And this one showed really great state and local integration. And so that's how this one made it in there.
Yeah, and I would just say in general, that one of the things that we try to describe in the book as a theme is the whole federalism aspect of land use, because land use is primarily a local tool. And, people always say, well, are you preempted by state statute or by a federal law? And sometimes you are. It's rare. What happens more often is that there's a federal law, and I'll just use another example, the Telecommunications Act, right? So we can't really keep cell towers out, but local governments have a lot of leeway in regulating where they go and how they're used, and if we can buffer them and other kinds of things. And so it goes together. So it's not as though there's complete federal control. The same thing, the Americans with Disabilities Act. We have to make accommodations, but it doesn't prescribe what type of reasonable accommodations you have to make. There's a lot of local discretion in that. In some areas, the states have taken over siting decisions. For example, with wind turbines in some states, depending upon the amount of megawatts that it puts out, it may go to a state siting board, taking the decision away from local governments. The same thing with siting of group homes. Sometimes you have those locally unwanted land uses, or the LULUs, because of the NIMBYs and the NIM2s, right? The NIMBY's not in my backyard, the NIM2's not in my term of office. And it's always a great conversation with the students. When should it stay a local decision? And when should the federal or state governments get involved? And, sometimes the students realize at the end of the conversation, it's their own personal bias that dictates what the answer is going to be.
I have a follow-up question to that about updating the book and different cases that get put in. I know that there's plenty of case law and new cases going through all the time, but is it more, here's some more current cases that would be good examples for this specific topic that you update? Or are there some pretty major changes that completely shift how we interpret that specific topic, and you have a lot of changing how we're interpreting instead?
So I think it's a little bit of a combination. I think that primarily, as I described earlier, the nutshell, it's published by a legal publisher for law students. And so to make it relevant to the law students, we have to make sure that we're addressing the cases that they're reading in probably 6 or 8 different land use case books that are on the market that different law schools use. So the first thing that we do when we put out a new edition, when we start to work on it, is we look at the table of contents of the latest editions of all of the legal case books for law students. And we make sure that we hit on making sure that that is included the cases that are used the most in all of those books. And then we look ourselves for topics that we think are emerging trends. Like one year, we added a section on environmental justice. There's no case law on it. There wasn't then much on the land use side, yes, on the EPA environmental siting side, but that was for EPA permits. But my theory is that environmental justice can be addressed more powerfully through local land use decision making, because the local boards get to decide where you're going to put the bus depot and where you're going to put trucks and other things that may cause asthma, air pollution and things, even though they got to be somewhere. But are they going next to a low-income minority community, or are they going someplace out where people aren't living? So that's an example of a trend that we thought was important that we wanted to add before it was really in the case books. And I think likewise, there's a lot on climate change. And sometimes we have to pull back in that area because it's a separate discipline. There are separate courses in law school just on climate change law. But yet it's a local land use issue as well. And so we want to make sure that the students are getting those emerging issues. And of course, secondarily, planning students, and if members of planning boards and zoning boards are going to use this as a resource and a guide as to what they should be thinking about legally and from a policy standpoint. We try to make sure that it's in there as well. Again, in a pocketbook, it's a short book.
Looking into your crystal balls, what changes do you see on the horizon in either a next edition of the Land Use Law in a Nutshell book or just in the field of land use law?
Patty already mentioned the importance of climate change. And I think, that's going to be a continuing area of expansion is, laws that mitigate and adapt to climate change. That'll be evolving and ongoing. I also think that we'll probably be making changes to the origin story of land use law, as Patty discussed earlier. That's going to be amended as that begins to be put into case books more and more. And also, I would say housing law, because of the emphasis today on fair housing, the national housing crisis going on, housing insecurity, and the social determinants of health and how critical housing is to public health.
And I would add that on the affordable housing, there's a movement now to eliminate single family zoning. And that's being done primarily legislatively at the local government level. There are some state laws that are being enacted, and so that's going to change the dynamic. We're an aging population. The Administration on Aging says by 2030, which is only 8 years away, there'll be more people over age 65 than under age 15. So what does that housing dynamic look for seniors? And, we have seniors who are impoverished and live in public housing. We have seniors who are house rich and cash poor and living on a fixed income. And we're going through a period now where there is inflation, but people's checks aren't increasing and costs are going up and costs of contractors are going up. So you may have a house, but if you need to replace the roof or you need to replace the heating system, you may not have that kind of money in the bank and you don't have that kind of income to make those monthly payments. We also have seniors we have healthy aging and seniors that can be independent. And then we have seniors that have health issues as they continue to age and they want to be near family. And so what's that going to do with accessory dwelling units and with in-law apartments and things that traditionally we haven't allowed in single family zones? And now we have to rethink that because society is changing. And then just the other example, I expect that over the next few years, we'll probably see some changes in regulatory takings jurisprudence from the Supreme Court.
I live in Oregon, so we're eliminating R1 and we're getting tons of ADUs and middle housing and all of that is happening. It's exciting. It's just a way that we think about owning property. I think it's going to need to change at some point. The ownership of property is just something that I see shifting around in certain places, maybe not everywhere.
Just another fun topic that you may hear my dogs barking in the background. We've become a society that treats our pets like members of the family. It used to be that the dogs were outside in the doghouse. Now they have car seats and clothes, and they take them on planes and trains, and they're functionally a member of the family. Laws are changing in the states to allow people and pets to be buried together. Well, in zoning, everything goes by definitions in the zoning ordinance, and zoning ordinances may define cemeteries as just for human remains. But some states, like New York, have set up so that you can have your pet buried with you. So we have separate pet cemeteries, we have human cemeteries, then we have some laws that allow for the interment of both in specific places. But zoning has to catch up with that at the local level. So it's something that's allowed. It's just going to be a trend that I think that we're going to see. I'll just say one of Professor Nolan's students just wrote a great article that's coming out in the New York Zoning Law and Practice Report this month on the emergence of the use of racial impact assessments. And so, land use still works with environmental law to the extent that many of our states, 17 states, have mini NEPAs. So we have state environmental review laws. We also have voluntary health impact assessments that are used widely in Europe and in other countries but not so much in the United States. They have been used to look at some land use and zoning decision making, but not a requirement. And so now another iteration of this is the idea of a racial impact assessment and looking at what the zoning is doing and how it might impact some underrepresented communities.
I have a list of questions, and we've covered kind of a lot of them and just in the answers that we've just gone through. I guess one maybe that we haven't quite touched on is if there's any specific land use litigation that you're following in your state or elsewhere in the country.
For me, it's not a specific case, but Patty mentioned already takings. The California Builders Association versus San Jose case from a few years ago said that mandatory inclusionary zoning is not considered a taking, and the Supreme Court denied cert. But with the new court, that's potentially vulnerable, and I'm very interested in watching what happens in that area.
So I tend to generally watch things that happen at the local level to know what people are interested in and how they're using their property. So lately there's been a bunch of treehouse cases and local governments not allowing tree houses. But then again, some tree houses are more elaborate than other tree houses. And then recently there was a local case in upstate New York where somebody basically put a water park in their backyard. And, the neighbors could see it. But is that a bad thing or not a bad thing? People that have tennis courts, and now the latest craze is a pickleball court. And so you put it in your backyard, but what happens when you put lights on it so that you could play at night? And what does the noise and the lights do to your neighbors? And so should we zone it out? Should we just let it go by nuisance law? There have been crazy cases where people that have a lot of property have put a regulation-sized Little League baseball field in their backyard so their kids and their friends could play. Is that bringing traffic? Is that creating noise? Is that a nuisance? Or is there nobody nearby to see it? And so, I've looked at those. I've looked at in the Hudson Valley, Legoland just came into town. And so looking at all of the environmental and community impacts, on one hand, you have always the push for economic development. And then the question is, at what cost? It's the same thing with the siting of casinos. They bring revenue in, but you have gambling addiction problems. And then you have traffic issues in the community. And then you're putting people to work in the casinos. And if you're allowing cigarette smoking in the casinos, you're creating public health issues. And that's where health impact assessments have been done. And so, I think just looking at all of the things and thinking about them, everything that happens, it's old and it's new at the same time.
One question that I had is, so I took one course on land use law during my planning degree about 10 years ago. And what I remember from it is the seminal cases of Euclid, Nolan, Dolan, and since then Reed impacting how we do sign regulations. Are there any other kind of seminal cases that have really impacted how we operate or as planners or how we structure our zoning and land use at a city level?
So I think that we have evolved the body of law. I'm not going to say it's a seminal case because it's a series of cases since there's been no Supreme Court case, but on the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act. Again, another federal statute that has hundreds and hundreds of reported land use decisions and, all different kinds of issues within that statute, trying to nail down what is religious exercise and what is a substantial burden and what is treating different uses, essentially the same on equal terms. And the federal circuit courts, there are some splits still, but, that continues to evolve and a trend that we watch. But I think it's pretty clear to planners and municipal officials and municipal attorneys that it's an area where we have to be very, 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 very careful because the overwhelming majority of time, not every time, but the overwhelming majority of time, the religious uses tend to win these cases. And when they win these cases, they get their attorney's fees as well. And so it becomes very costly for municipalities. So you really have to be on firm ground if you're making those kinds of decisions, because of course the statute was designed not to keep people out. The same thing that we were talking about in reframing land use and the Euclid case, and Jenny mentioned the next reframing of the book and people wanting to know a little bit more about the origins. We could look at it in housing, and we could look at it as minority groups, and RLUIPA is really looking at it as minority religious groups. So, other seminal cases, yes, they're coming out. There's been an evolution in regulatory takings cases, more that have happened since you were a student in school and beyond the Penn Central case, which stands for one thing, and the Nolan Dolan on the exaction sides. We're looking at the parcel as a whole, or not. We're looking at judicial takings in the Kuntz case and how it controls how local governments can and can't negotiate with developers, and what might be a trigger, and what might be a trigger in one municipality is not going to be a trigger in another municipality.
Speaking of a seminal case, I have a question about how do you explain the concept of reciprocity of advantage that comes up in the Pennsylvania Cole versus Mahone case when you're in your classes? I noticed in the Land Use Law in a Nutshell book, there was an example of common interest communities to kind of illustrate that concept working. And I wondered if you had any other ways or tricks to explaining that concept to students.
I talk about it a little bit when I talk about the Penn Central case, where the railroad company argued that they were carrying a burden that should be carried by the public as a whole under the Armstrong case, and which said that individuals shouldn't carry burdens that should be carried by the public as a whole. The company was saying that they were being burdened by the landmark preservation restrictions, and the court said that they weren't because of reciprocity of advantage. All land use laws burden and benefit individual property owners differently. Some owners are benefited more than others, and some are more burdened, but on the whole, they all benefit from a well-planned community. So I raise it a little bit with that one with the Penn Central case.
I always have a hard time with reciprocity of advantage when we talk about the Hadachek decision. Final question is, are there any topics that you would have liked to have seen included in Land Use Law in a Nutshell, 3rd edition, that needed to be cut? Was there like a size issue or anything that you wish had been included that wasn't not included this time?
So I think sometimes there's always the temptation to put in more. And so, we have cut from our casebook, for example, a lot in the area of local environmental land use law. And truthfully, as time has gone on, there's new casebooks that are about local environmental law that intersect with land use. What I think we're going to see in the 4th edition, some of the things that we've also learned from COVID. It's maybe taught us differently about thinking about home occupations. A lot more people working from home. That's changed our traffic patterns as well. So we may have some definitional issues. There may be some reuse and mixed use of commercial real estate as a result of people maybe buying more online and not going to retail shops, and also large companies that are allowing their employees to work from home. We don't need that commercial office space in the same way that we used to. I think that we're going to see more in the area of outside dining, food truck regulation, sidewalk cafes. This was not something that people really thought about in any big way before, but once people started wanting to be outside and not inside, out of fear for what was traveling in the air and thinking it was better in the great outdoors, I think that's changed how we look at space. I think we're going to see in the next edition more in the area of technology with respect to drones. Zoning enforcement is one way that you could use drones, but how do you get past the 4th Amendment? What's in plain view? It may not be in plain view from what you can see at eye level, but if you have a drone flying above, you can see it. Now, on one hand, say the municipality can't trespass and fly a drone, but what if your neighbor's kids have a drone or your neighbor has a drone and it's up in the air and you just happen to have video of something that's illegal on the property and hasn't been permitted, can you use it or not? And there's a few reported cases now. I think that we're going to see more of those. I think that we're going to see more in other kinds of technology uses as well. And there's a growing body of regulation and case law with respect to Airbnb and short-term rentals. These are the trends, right? I don't know if the trends are going to be the seminal cases. They will have seminal cases in those areas, but the nutshell really is designed to capture the key important takeaways of what you need to know on First Amendment, on Fifth Amendment, on the big state statutory areas that regulate how far we can go and how imaginative we can be when it comes to planning and land use regulation.
As far as, things that got cut too, we had talked about including more on the racial underpinnings of zoning and that whole origin story. But as Patty said at the beginning, really the main purpose of the West Nutshell series is to help law students understand their classes. So, in looking at what case books had at the time, we weren't seeing as much. And obviously that will be changing. I know that Patty's casebook will have, it'll have the Buchanan case, many others. And so there's gonna be a whole chapter on that. And so, now we will get to include that in the nutshell because we'll be explaining what students are looking at their casebooks and wanting to know more. And as we're seeing local governments take more action in terms of reparations and whatnot, there will be a lot more out there, a lot more material to include. So that's something that was cut that is definitely something that needs to be included as that makes it into casebook.
And I think we had a lot on transit-oriented development and thinking about the transportation connection. But again, that got into more in the planning sphere and less in the core legal zoning sphere. And so, we always struggle with that because even though we're lawyers like to think that they're planners and planners like to think that they're lawyers. And so we like to work together and cross over. And Jenny is a LEED certified professional. And so thinking about some of those issues in green development, again, there's not a lot of it in the legal case books, but it's something that is always in the forefront of our minds.
To wrap up, what's the most important thing that you want listeners of this show to take away from either your book or just land use law in general that maybe couldn't have made it into the book since it is such a condensed and focused piece of literature?
So my takeaway and my advice is that no matter how many years we have in our professions and whether you're a lawyer, a planner, a board member, an engineer, an architect, whoever might be listening to this podcast, the law is evolving. Our thought about planning concepts is evolving. And the most important thing for all of us is to continue to read, continue to think, continue to have conversation and dialogue, stay on top of things, and the future and how our communities look is really up to us. And so on one hand, understanding the core legal concepts and what you can do, but then it's not just accepting, well, this is how it's always been, but then figuring out how can we push the boundaries to get to the next place and to make those evolutions. And that really, to me, is the most exciting part about being a practitioner in this space.
And I would say this is something that planners certainly know, but as far as the audience of being students, I think one of the things that they walk away from the book with is an understanding that land use law is primarily local and it comes out of respect for local knowledge and the local democratic process, but it needs to be monitored and adjusted by the state from which it derives its power, right? So there's states that are preempting single family zoning, like we've talked about, requiring ADUs and missing middle housing, and states like Oregon and Connecticut, Massachusetts, California. And the federal government is a government of limited powers, and states have that police power, and they elected to give that to local governments, that incredible authority to determine how things are designed and what gets built on the landscape. And most students come to law school thinking especially an environmental law school like PACE, where I am, they're thinking about state and federal regulation and that understanding about how local land use law is and how it's one of the most important aspects of how to properly regulate development to protect the environment is something that is so important and exciting, and I think is new to a lot of incoming law students.
Well, I just want to thank you both, Jenny and Patricia, for coming on the episode with us today.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.